Why my CVD did not recur after 2004. TSI Monitoring and Longitudinal Evidence Part 2, No. 1573, BPT 110, March 14, 2026, Gerald C. EclaireMD Foundation. Category: Cardiovascular Disease Prevention. Concept of the Triggering Sensitivity Index TSI. Arterial stiffness can be approximated using pulse pressure. Pulse pressure PP is defined as PP equals SBP dBP, where SBP is systolic blood pressure and dBP is diastolic blood pressure, when arteries lose elasticity due to aging or metabolic damage, particularly vascular calcification resulting from long-term diabetes. This change is reflected by an increase in pulse pressure. In simple terms, higher pulse pressure indicates a stiffer vascular structure. I gained this understanding by carefully reviewing more than 100 CT scan films ATDR. Neil Schwartz's office, chairman of the Stanford University Stroke Department, on September 11, 2025. This experience allowed me to connect these medical observations with engineering concepts of dynamic plastic structural behavior that I learned in Professor Norman Jones's lectures at MIT in 1972. The second mechanical factor is systolic blood pressure itself. Systolic blood pressure represents the instantaneous pressure load applied to the vascular wall. When systolic pressure rises, the mechanical stress applied to the vessel increases. Therefore, the interaction between arterial stiffness and systolic pressure determines the mechanical stress environment of the vascular system. Extension to the models of TSI-3 and TSI-3B. As my research progressed, I realized that vascular triggering conditions are influenced not only by blood pressure but also by long-term metabolic conditions. Diabetes and chronic hyperglycemia gradually damage vascular structures through multiple mechanisms including endothelial dysfunction, inflammation, and glycation. These processes lead to calcification of the blood vessel walls. For this reason, I extended the two-factor CT model into a three-factor framework called TSI-3 and TSI-3B. The three variables included are: 1. Pulse pressure PP representing arterial stiffness to systolic blood pressure SBP, representing acute pressure load. 3. Estimated average glucose EEG representing metabolic vascular damage. Before July 2018, continuous glucose monitoring CGM technology was not available to me in the US, even though CGM had already been available in Europe and China since 2016. Therefore, the AG values used in my TSI-3B model were derived from frequent CGM glucose measurements obtained after July 2018. Longitudinal results from the TSI-3 model. See figures using my pathophysiological dataset. I calculated the annual TSI-3 averages from 2012 to 2026.201 to 212.40201, 161.95 for 110.93 to 592. 500 to 1016 81.11 to 1781.56 to 1883.49. 2019 98.06 to 88.15 to 185.11 to 286.37 to 389.29 to for 91.56 to 587.07 to 690.69. These numbers reveal a very clear structural transition in my vascular condition between 2012 and 2016. The TSI dropped sharply from 212 to about 81, representing a reduction of approximately 60%. After 2016, the TSI values stabilized within a relatively narrow range between roughly 80 and 92. This explains why my CVD events did not recur. Interpretation from an engineering perspective. From an engineering viewpoint, the vascular system behaves like a mechanical structure subjected to internal pressure loading. If the structural integrity of vessel walls is weakened, even moderate pressure spikes can generate excessive stress, an earlier phase of my health history. Between 1994 and 2004, my vascular system likely operated in a high-stress regime. Metabolic problems, including diabetes and poor glucose control, contributed to progressive vascular damage. At the same time, fluctuations in blood pressure have created triggering conditions. In contrast, the longitudinal data from the past decade shows that the vascular system gradually transitioned into a stable operating regime. In engineering terms, the system moved from a high-stress and stable region into a controlled equilibrium region. Stable operating range of the vascular system. After 2016, the TSI values remained relatively stable between approximately 80 and 92. This stable range could serve as my personal vascular safety zone. When the system operates within this range, the probability of triggering a cardiovascular event becomes much lower. The difference between stroke and CVD. The same dataset can have different interpretations because CVD and stroke involve different blood vessels and failure mechanisms. CVD usually occurs when coronary arteries become narrowed and blood flow is blocked. Stroke, especially hemorrhagic stroke, occurs when fragile brain vessels rupture under pressure. Therefore, the same stress factors such as arterial stiffness and blood pressure can lead to different outcomes depending on which vascular system is affected. Importance of longitudinal monitoring. Most traditional medical studies rely on cross-sectional measurements. These measurements capture only a single snapshot of a patient's condition. However, cardiovascular disease develops slowly over many years. Longitudinal monitoring allows observation of trajectories rather than isolated measurements. In my case, the trajectory clearly shows a transition from a high-risk regime to a stable regime. Why my CVD did not recur. Although I do not possess detailed pathophysiological data from 1994 to 2004, the long-term dataset after 2010 strongly supports for observations. 1. Long-term glucose control reduced my metabolic damage to blood vessels. 2. Improved blood pressure control reduced my mechanical stress on vessel walls through regular physical activity. Daily walking around or above 10,000 steps improved my vascular elasticity. 4. Continuous TSI self-monitoring allowed early detection and correction of abnormal pathophysiological trends. Together, these 4 factors lowered my triggering sensitivity index TSI into a stable operating range. Once the system remained within this range for many years, the probability of triggering a cardiovascular event became significantly reduced. This provides a mechanical explanation for why my cardiovascular disease episodes have not recurred after 2004. Conclusion. The triggering sensitivity index TSI provides a simple mechanical framework for monitoring vascular stress for both CVD and stroke. By combining arterial stiffness, blood pressure load, and metabolic damage into a single indicator, the TSI-3 and TSI-3B models provide a quantitative method for observing and monitoring long-term risks of both stroke and cardiovascular diseases. Using 17 years of longitudinal physiological data, the results show a clear transition from a high-risk vascular state to a stable operating regime. This transition explains why my cardiovascular disease events have not recurred for more than 2 decades. Disclaimer: I write this paper not for fame, but to share what I have learned so others can understand their health, prevent disease, and live longer, healthier lives. This content is provided for educational reference only and does not constitute medical advice. No doctor-patient relationship is created. You may share this summary freely, but it must not be altered, edited, or republished as your own. All intellectual property rights and copyrights for this article and its related materials belong to T.E. author, Gerald C. This content is provided for educational reference only and does not constitute medical advice. No doctor-patient relationship is created. You may share this summary freely, but it must not be altered, edited, or republished as your own. All intellectual property rights and copyrights for this article and its related materials belong to the author, Gerald C.